Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline over long stretches of time, and we may be living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. The decline of violence, to be sure, has not been steady. It has not brought violence down to zero, to put it mildly, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to convince you that it's a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from the waging of wars and perpetration of genocides to the spanking of children and the treatment of animals. I'm going to present 6 major historical declines of violence. In each case, cite their immediate causes in terms of what historians have told us are the likely immediate historical antecedents in that era, and then speculate on their ultimate causes in terms of general historical forces acting on human nature. The first major decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until about 5,000 years ago, humans lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? Well, this is a question that thinkers have speculated on for centuries. Most prominently, this gentleman, Thomas Hobbes, who famously said that the life of man in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, he was countered by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. In reality, both of these gentlemen were talking through their hats. They had no idea of what life was like in a state of nature. But today we can do better, because there are 2 sources of evidence of what rates of violence were like in pre-state societies. One of them is forensic archaeology. You can think of it as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons have signs of violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitated skeletons, femurs with bronze arrowheads embedded in them, and mummies found with ropes around their necks. There are 20 archaeological samples that I know of for which these analyses have been done, and they range. I've plotted here the percentage of deaths due to violent trauma. They range as high as 60%, but the average is a little bit more than 15%. Well, let's compare that rate with those of modern states, and let's stack the deck against modernity by picking some of the most violent eras that we can think of. This is the United States and Europe in the 20th century. This is the entire world in the 20th century, and I've thrown in all of not only the wars, but also the genocides and the man-made famines. It's about 3% compared to the 15% of state societies. And this is the world in the first decade of the 21st century. The graph would be less than a pixel. It's about a 3/100ths of 1%. The other method of measuring violence in pre-state societies is ethnographic vital statistics. What is the rate of death by violence in people who have recently lived outside of state control, namely hunter-gatherers, hunter-horticulturalists, and other tribal groups? Here there are 27 samples that I know of ethnographic demographers who've done the calculation. I've plotted them as war deaths per 100,000 people per year, and they go as high as 1,500, but the average across these 27 non-state societies is a little bit more than 500. Again, let's stack the deck by picking some of the most violent modern societies for comparison, such as, for example, Germany in the 20th century, 2 world wars. The rate is around 135 compared to 524. Russia in the 20th century had 2 world wars and a revolution and a civil war, about 130. Japan in the 20th century, about 30. United States in the 20th century, 2 world wars plus 5 wars in Asia, about a pixel. The world in the 20th century, this is the figure that I alluded to earlier that includes all of the wars and genocides and man-made famines, probably around 60. And this is the world in the first decade of the 21st century, again, far less than 1 pixel. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. What was the immediate cause? Well, it was almost certainly the rise and expansion of states. Anyone who familiar with world history knows about the various paxes, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. The historians' term for the phenomenon in which when a state expands and an empire imposes hegemony over a territory, they try to stamp out tribal raiding and feuding, and that is what drives the statistics down. It's not that they had any particularly benevolent interest in the welfare of their subjects, but rather tribal raiding and feuding is a nuisance to imperial overlords for the same reason that a farmer will take steps to prevent its cattle from killing each other, because it's just a dead loss to the farmer. Imperial overlords tend to frown on tribal battles that just shuffle resources and destroy the tax base at a net loss to them. The second major historical decline of violence can be captured in this woodcut of a typical day in the life in the Middle Ages. And the process has been called the civilizing process. It's best illustrated by looking at homicide statistics, which go back to, in many parts of Europe, to the 13th century. The historical criminologist Manuel Eisner has assembled every estimate that he can find of homicide rates from records in England going back to about 1200. I've plotted them here on a logarithmic scale, so that the scale goes from 100 homicides per 100,000 per year to 10 to 1 to a tenth of a homicide. And as you can see, there is an almost 2 order of magnitude decline in homicide from the Middle Ages to the present. So a contemporary Englishman has about a 50-fold less chance of being murdered than his compatriot in the Middle Ages. By the way, this very high point here of 100 per 100,000 per year comes from Oxford. This is a phenomenon that's not restricted to England, but it is true of every European country for which statistics are available. Again, this is in logarithmic scale, so it goes in between 10 and 100 down to a very narrow window of about 1 per 100,000 per year. Here is an average of the 5 Western European regions, and just to connect it to the previous historical development, I've plotted the non-state society's average over here. It's about 500 per 100,000 per year. This gap is what I've called the pacification process. Then the civilizing process is this additional 30 to 50-fold reduction in the rate of homicide to the present. The immediate cause was probably first identified by Norbert Elias in his classic book called The Civilizing Process, from which I got the name for this development, that in the transition from Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of centralized states and kingdoms throughout Europe. Criminal justice was nationalized, and warlords, feuding, and brigandage was replaced by the king's justice. Simultaneously, there was a growing infrastructure of commerce, development of institutions of money and finance, technologies of transportation and timekeeping. The result was to shift the incentive structure from zero-sum plunder to positive-sum trade. The third historical decline of violence pertains to the fact that those first states, though they did bring down rates of feuding and vendetta and blood revenge, they were rather nasty contraptions, and they kept people in a state of awe with techniques such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, sawing in half, impalement, and clawing. But in a process that historians call the humanitarian revolution, these forms of institutionalized violence were eventually abolished. And the momentum for this movement was concentrated in the 18th century. This graph shows the abolition of judicial torture, that is, torture as a form of punishment in the major countries of the day, including the famous prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment by the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Also, during this period, there was a reduction in the use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In the 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes was down to 4. Similarly, in the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries, the death penalty was prescribed and used for theft, sodomy, bestiality, adultery, witchcraft, concealing birth, burglary, slave revolt, counterfeiting, and horse theft. We have statistics for when capital punishment was used in the United States since colonial times. And as you can see, in the 17th century, a majority of executions were for crimes other than homicide. By the in current time, the only crime that is punished by capital punishment other than homicide is conspiracy to commit homicide. The death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in most of Europe. Most of the abolitions were concentrated in the last 50 years. This is the number of European countries with capital punishment. Currently, only Russia and Belarus has it on the books. But interestingly, well before the capital punishment was abolished by the stroke of a pen, it had fallen into disuse. And you can see that the percentage of European countries that actually carry out executions has always been far lower, and the decline began much earlier. Now, the United States, of course, notoriously is the only Western democracy that has capital punishment, even then only in 2/3 of the states, and a number that has been dwindling. But to say that the United States has the death penalty is a bit of a fiction, because if you look at the number of executions as a proportion of the population, it has been plunging since colonial times, and now out of about 16,500 homicides per year, there are about 50 executions, and that has been in decline as well. Other abolitions during the humanitarian revolution include witch hunts, religious persecution, dueling, blood sports, debtors' prisons, and of course, most famously, slavery. This graph shows the cumulative number of countries that abolished slavery, and for the first time in history, slavery is illegal everywhere in the world. The last country to abolish it was, anyone know, by the way? Saudi Arabia was 1962, so it was the second most recent. Mauritania in 1980. What were the immediate causes of the humanitarian revolution? Well, a plausible guess might be affluence. One might surmise that as one's own life becomes more pleasant, one places a higher value on life in general. However, I don't think the timing works. This is a graph of per capita income in England over the last 800 years, and most, I think, economic historians would say that the world saw virtually no increase in affluence until the time of the Industrial Revolution, starting in the early decades of the 19th century, whereas most of the reforms that I've been talking about were concentrated in the 18th century when income growth was pretty much flat. However, there was one technology that showed a precocious increase in productivity before the Industrial Revolution, and that was printing. Here's a graph showing the efficiency in book production, which increased 25-fold by 1700. The efficiency was put into use and resulted in an exponential growth in the number of books published per year in England, France, and other Western European countries. And there were more literate people around to read them. By the 18th century, a majority of men in England were literate. Why should literacy matter? Well, a number of the causes are summed up by the term the Enlightenment. For one thing, knowledge replaced superstition and ignorance. Beliefs such as that Jews poison wells, heretics go to hell, witches cause crop failures, children are possessed, Africans are brutish, and so on. As Voltaire said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy gives rise to cosmopolitanism. It is plausible that the reading of history and journalism and fiction puts people into the habit of inhabiting other people's minds, which could increase empathy and therefore make cruelty less appealing. This is a point that I'll return to later in the talk. The fourth historical decline of violence has been called the long peace. And it speaks to the widespread belief that the 20th century was the most violent in history, which would seem to go against everything that I've been saying so far. Peculiarly, one never sees in any of the claims that the 20th century was the most violent in history any numbers from any century other than the 20th. There's no question that there was a lot of violence in the 20th century. But just to take one century for comparison, one often hears about the peaceful 19th century. Well, the peaceful 19th century had the Napoleonic Wars, 4 million deaths, one of the worst in history. The Taiping Rebellion, by far the worst civil war in history in China, 20 million deaths. The worst war in American history, the Civil War. The reign of Shaka Zulu in southern Africa, resulting in probably 1 to 2 million deaths. The War of the Triple Alliance, which is probably the most destructive interstate war in history in terms of percentage of the population killed, 60% of Paraguay. The African slave raiding wars, no one has any idea what the death toll was. And, of course, imperial wars in Africa, Asia, and the South Pacific. Now, this is all qualitative. This is just to damp down the tendency to think that because, indeed, in Europe there was a span of a number of decades without war, to jump to the false conclusion that the world as a whole was peaceful in the 19th century. This is now it is undoubtedly true that the Second World War was the deadliest event in human history in terms of number of lives lost. It's not so clear that it was the deadliest event in terms of percentage of the world population. This is a graph that I've adapted from a forthcoming book by Matthew White, who calls himself an atrocitologist. Namely, he tries to fit numbers to wars, genocides, and man-made famines throughout history. Here's 2,500 years of human history, and this is White's top 100 atrocities, which I have scaled by the estimated size of the world population at the time. As you can see, World War II just barely makes the top 10. There are many events more deadly than World War I. And events that killed anywhere from 0.1% of the population of the world to 10% were pretty much evenly sprinkled over 2,500 years of history. Now, this funneling of points, this concentration of points in the last few centuries does not mean that in ancient times they only committed big atrocities and we commit both big and little atrocities. It's rather an artifact of historical myopia, namely the closer you get to the present, the more information you have. The smaller atrocities in the past just were trees falling in the forest with no one to hear them, or were not even deemed worthy of being written down. Let's zoom in now on the last 500 years, because there is a data set from Jack Levy on trends in great power war. These are wars that involve the 800-pound gorillas of the day, that is the countries that can project military power outside their boundaries, which account for a disproportionate amount of the damage due to war, because wars fall along a power law distribution of damage. The first trend that one can see is the proportion of years that the great powers fought each other, and it goes from 1500 to 2000. What the graph shows is that several centuries ago, war was basically the natural state of things. There were periods in which the great powers were always at war. That was just what great powers did. They fought other great powers. And that the percentage of time great powers have fought each other has plummeted over the centuries. That is because of two trends, both also showing declines. One is the duration of wars involving a great power. We used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War. The 20th century had things like the Six-Day War. Also, the frequency of wars has been trending downward, from about 9 new wars per year involving the great powers to fewer than 4. One trend, though, that has gone in the opposite direction for most of the last 500 years is how bad the wars were when they happened. This is a graph of I call it deadliness of wars involving a great power, namely battle deaths per nation year. That is, how much damage was concentrated in a given year of war for a different country. That, because of advances in military technology, but even more so in social organization, meant that wars got more and more deadly until 1950, where the trend abruptly reversed. And for the first time in history, both the frequency and the deadliness of wars went downward. Again, this is on logarithmic scale, so a typical war cost a typical nation in a typical year as many as battle deaths in the hundreds of thousands. Now they're closer to the tens of thousands. So if you now zoom in on the last century, the 20th century, this is a graph showing deaths in war all over the world, not just the great powers. And it shows that the increase in deadliness of war did indeed result in two horrific spikes of bloodletting centered around the two world wars, but that since then there has been a long stretch without that degree of bloodletting. And the fact that the 20th century comprises 100 years, not just 50 years, is one of the reasons why it's misleading to say that the 20th century was the most violent in history.
Is the denominator the world population or the population size of countries involved in war?
No, the world population. Yeah. I mean, there's arguments for doing it either way. The problem is that you can make the numbers go all over the place depending on the choice of the denominator, whether you choose the country that initiated the war, the collateral damage in other countries, the neighboring countries, and so on. So I've, in all cases, plotted against world population. In fact, this extraordinary 65-year stretch since the end of the Second World War, which has been called the Long Peace, has perhaps the most striking statistics about that stretch are zero. There were 0 wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers of the era, contrary to every expert prediction. No nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki, again confounding everyone's expectations. No wars between any of the great powers since the end of the Korean War in 1953. 0 wars between Western European countries. The extraordinary thing about this fact is how unextraordinary it sounds. So if I say I'm going to predict that in my lifetime France and Germany will not go to war, everyone would say, well, yeah, of course they won't go to war. But that is an extraordinary statement, and especially when you consider that before 1945, Western European countries initiated 2 new wars per year for more than 600 years. That number has now gone down, has stood at 0 for 65 years. And there have been 0 wars between developed countries at all. We take it for granted nowadays that war is something that happens out in those poor, primitive parts, countries. That is an extraordinary development when war was just what rich countries did.
I want to make one statement
Yeah.
that's fascinating. It's also the first time in history that Europe doesn't dominate world politics.
Yes,
And that has made
that's interesting.
like unified Europe in some sense.
Yes, this little peninsula on the Eurasian landmass no longer...
And therefore it is more peaceful now because the world domination has moved outside Europe for the first time in 2 millennia.
That's one way. Another way to put it is the fact that Europe, which traditionally has been the part of the world with the biggest military might, is no longer picking on countries in other parts of the world or hurling artillery shells at one another with the rest of the world suffering collateral damage. But yes, I think the change in Europe has been quite extraordinary. Now, what about the rest of the world? What has happened in the other continents while Europe has been racking up its peaceful zeros? Well, let's first look at just the number of wars. And these graphs now start at 1946, and they span the entire globe. Well, and I'll divide it into categories of war. The one kind of war has simply vanished off the face of the earth, the colonial war, which used to be quite destructive, which no longer exists because the European powers have given up their colonies. This is, by the way, a stacked layer graph, so the relevant visual variable is the thickness of the bars. Here we see the fate of interstate wars, that is, wars between 2 sovereign states, which also has been dwindling since the end of the Second World War. However, the number of civil wars, both pure civil wars within a country and international civil wars, where some foreign country butts in, usually on the side of the government defending itself against an insurgency, increased until about 1990, and then has shown somewhat of a decrease as well. So since 1946, there have been fewer wars between states. There have been more civil wars, mainly because newly independent states with inept governments were challenged by insurgent movements, both sides stoked by the Cold War powers. But even civil wars declined after 1991 with the end of the Cold War and the stoking of both sides by the superpowers. The crucial question now is, which wars kill more people? Fewer wars between countries, more wars within countries, is it all the same? So let's compare them. This graph shows the deadliness of interstate wars since the 1950s. That is, how many people are killed in a particular year of war, and as you can see, it has plummeted. I've already talked about that fact. These are the internationalized civil wars, and these are the civil wars. So the fact that we have more civil wars and fewer interstate wars means that the total number of people has gone down, because interstate wars of the past killed far more people than the civil wars of the present. Now let's put the numbers back together again, and instead of looking at number of wars, look at number of deaths, again scaled by world population. This is the number of people killed in colonial wars since 1946. Here we see the number of people killed in interstate wars. These spikes correspond to the eras of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq War. These are the number of people killed in civil wars and internationalized civil wars. So the trajectory has been, to be sure, quite bumpy. But in the first decade of the 21st century, we were actually living in a time that, even in comparison to recent decades, is comparatively peaceable. And in fact, one could almost say that the dream of the 1960s folk singers is coming true, that the world is putting an end to war. What about genocide? These, the last couple of graphs are state-based conflicts. That's when you've got basically two organized armed forces, one of which is at least one of which is a government. What about cases where governments kill their own citizens? Now again, there's a cliche that the 20th century was the age of genocide. But if you look at, again, this claim is never made with any systematic comparison of previous centuries. Historians who have tried to track genocide over these centuries are unanimous on this point. Frank Chalk and Kurt Jonassen, for example, in their History of Genocide, say on page 1, genocide has been practiced in all regions of the world and during all periods in history. What did change during the 20th century is the age in which people started to care about genocide. It's the century in which the word genocide was coined, and in which, for the first time, genocide was considered a bad thing, something to be denied instead of boasted about. As Chalk and Jonassen say of ancient histories, we know that empires have disappeared and that cities were destroyed, and we suspect that some wars were genocidal in their results. But we do not know what happened to the bulk of the populations involved in these events. Their fate was simply too unimportant. When they were mentioned at all, they were usually lumped together with the herds of oxen, sheep, and other livestock. Just to give you some examples from some of these genocides, depending on how seriously you take Old Testament history, if it were taken literally, there were genocides on almost every page: the Amalekites, Amorites, Canaanites, Hivites, Hittites, Jebusites, Midianites, Perizzites, and so on. The Athenians in Melos, the Romans in Carthage, the Mongol invasions, the Crusades, the European wars of religion, and the colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Australia. We only have anything even resembling numbers for the 20th century. But if we plot those numbers, then, and again, there is an impression that because of the massacres in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur, nothing has changed, that the world has learned nothing since the Holocaust. This is the best estimates that we can find of rates of death in genocide. And indeed, it is certainly true that there was a burst of genocides in the 1940s and 30s to the early 50s in Europe, and from the 20s through the 70s in Asia. But in the trend since World War II has been downward. It is definitely not the case that nothing has changed since the era of the Second World War, and even with the Rwandan genocide, a small proportion of the world compared to earlier decades is massacred by their governments. So what are the immediate causes of the long peace and what I call the new peace, that is the post-Cold War era? They were anticipated by Immanuel Kant in his remarkable essay Perpetual Peace from 1795, in which he suggested that democracy, trade, and an international community were all pacifying forces. This hypothesis has been taken up again by a pair of political scientists, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill, who've shown that all three increased in the second half of the 20th century, and in a set of regression analyses showed that all of them are statistical predictors of peace, holding everything else constant. So the number of democracies has increased since since the Second World War, and since the end of the Cold War has shot up relative to the number of autocracies. There's been a steady increase in international trade since the end of the Second World War. There's been a continuous increase in the number of intergovernmental organizations that countries have entered into. And especially since the end of the Cold War in 1990, there's been an increase in the number of international peacekeeping missions, and more importantly, international peacekeepers that get themselves in between warring nations, mostly in the developing world. The final historical development that I'll talk about I call the rights revolutions. And this is the reduction of systematic violence at smaller scales against vulnerable populations such as racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The civil rights revolution saw a reduction in the number of in the social practice of lynching. There used to be 150 lynchings per year in the United States. That has gone down to 0 over the course of the 20th century. The hate crime murders of blacks, which started to be recorded in the mid-1990s, went down from the single digits to 1. Non-lethal hate crimes, such as intimidation and assault, have been in decline since they were measured. The kinds of racist attitudes that encourage violence against minorities, such as the percentage of Americans saying that they would move if a black family moved in next door, or who believe that black and white students should go to separate schools, has now fallen into the noise, to the range of crank opinion, basically indistinguishable from 0. And this is a trend that has taken place not just in the United States but worldwide. The number of countries that have laws on the books that discriminate against ethnic, religious, or racial minorities has been in steady decline. And in fact, the number of countries that have tried to tilt the scale in the other direction with affirmative action and remedial discrimination policies has increased. So now more countries in the world discriminate in favor of disadvantaged minorities than discriminate against them. The women's rights movement has seen an 80% reduction in rape since the early 70s, when it was put on the agenda as a feminist problem. A 2/3 decline in domestic violence, spousal abuse and wife beating, and also a 50% decline in husband beating. In the most extreme form of domestic violence, namely uxoricide and mariticide, there's been a decline both in the number of wives that are murdered by their husbands and the number of husbands that have been murdered by their wives. In fact, the decrease is much more severe for men. Feminism has been very good to men, much more likely to survive a marriage without getting murdered by your wife. The children's rights movement has seen a decline in the United States of the number of states that permit corporal punishment in schools, paddling and hiding. In the rest of Western Europe, it's simply abolished outright. But even in the United States, it's been in decline. The approval of spanking has been, and the implementation of spanking has been in decline in every country in which it was measured. These are data from the United States, New Zealand, and Sweden. In fact, spanking is illegal in most European countries now. The child abuse has been in decline since statistics were recorded in the early 1990s. Violence in school, such as fighting and bullying, have been in decline. The gay rights movement has seen an increase in the number of states in the world and American states that have decriminalized homosexuality. It used to be a felony. Anti-gay attitudes have been in steady decline, such as whether homosexuality is morally wrong, whether it should be made illegal, and whether gay people should be denied equal opportunity. And hate crimes of intimidation have been in decline since they were first measured. The animal rights movement has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, and a decrease in the number of motion pictures in which animals have been harmed. Well, the key question now, why has violence declined over so many different scales of time and magnitude? Well, one possibility is that human nature has changed and people have lost their inclinations toward violence. Now, I consider this to be rather unlikely. For one thing, people continue to take enormous pleasure and allocate a lot of their disposable income to consuming simulated violence, such as in murder mysteries, Greek tragedy, Shakespearean dramas, Mel Gibson movies, video games, and hockey. But perhaps more to the point are studies of homicidal fantasies, which ask people the following question. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? You might want to think about that, reflect on that for a moment. When you ask that question of a demographic with a very low rate of actual violence, namely American university students, you find that about 15% of the women and a third of the men frequently fantasize about killing people they don't like. And more than 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people they don't like. And the rest of them are lying, of course. Or at the very least might sympathize with Clarence Darrow when he said, "I've never killed a man, but I've taken great pleasure in reading many obituaries." Now, a more likely possibility is that human nature comprises inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and that historical circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations. Well, what are the parts of human nature that militate toward violence? I count 5, depending on how you lump or split. There's raw exploitation, that is, seeking something that you want and a living thing happens to be in the way, such as in rape, plunder, conquest, and the elimination of rivals. Nothing particularly fancy in our psychology there other than a zeroing out of whatever inclinations would inhibit us from that kind of exploitation. There's the drive toward dominance, both the competition among individuals to be alpha male and the competition among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy or preeminence. There's the thirst for revenge, the kind of moralistic violence that justifies vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there's ideology, which might be numerically the biggest contributor of all, such as in militant religions, nationalism, fascism, Nazism, and communism, which lead to large-scale violence by a pernicious cost-benefit analysis. What these ideologies tend to have in common is that they posit a utopia that is infinitely good for infinitely long. Well, if you do the math, if the ends are infinitely good, then the means can be arbitrarily violent, and you're still on the positive side of the moral ledger. Also, what do you do with people who learn about an infinitely perfect world but oppose it nonetheless? Well, they are arbitrarily evil and deserve arbitrarily severe punishment. Well, now let's turn to the brighter side, our so-called better angels. I would say that they include the faculty of self-control, the ability to anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit violent impulses, the faculty of empathy, more technically sympathy, the ability to feel others' pain, the moral sense, which we seem to comprise a variety of intuitions, including tribalism, authority, purity, and fairness, which can actually go both ways, can push people to be more violent or less violent, depending on how they're deployed. And then reason, the cognitive faculties that allow us to engage in objective, detached analysis. So now for the crucial question. Which historical developments bring out our better angels? And I'm going to suggest that there are four. The first is that Hobbes got it right, and that a leviathan, that is a state and justice system with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, can reduce aggregate violence by eliminating the incentives for exploitative attack, by reducing the need for deterrence and vengeance, because Leviathan is going to deter your enemies, so you don't have to, and circumventing the self-serving biases, one of the major discoveries of social and evolutionary psychology the past several decades is that people tend to exaggerate their adversaries' malevolence and exaggerate their own innocence, which can stoke cycles of revenge when you have two sides, each of them intoxicated with their own self-serving biases. Some historical evidence that this is a major pacifying force is include the first two historical developments that I spoke of, namely the pacifying and civilizing processes, both of which were consequences of the rise of states. The fact that reversals where violence re-erupts tend to take place in zones of anarchy. The American Wild West, failed states, collapsed empires, and mafias and street gangs that deal in contraband so they can't call in the court system to enforce their interests in business disputes, but have to resort to intimidation and revenge. And the effectiveness of international peacekeepers who use a kind of soft power on the international stage to keep warring parties apart. Second pacifying force is the theory of gentle commerce, according to which plunder is a zero-sum game. The victor's gain, or even negative sum, the victor's gain is the loser's loss, whereas trade is positive sum. We'll hear more of this from both Lita and Martin, that reciprocal altruism, gains in trade, can result in both sides being better off after an interaction. That over history, improvements in technology have allowed goods and ideas to be traded over longer distances among larger groups of people and at lower cost, changing the incentive structure so that other people become more valuable alive than dead. Just to be concrete about it, I doubt that the United States is going to declare war on China, though there's much that we don't like about that country, because they make all our stuff. And I doubt they'll declare war on us because we owe them too much money. Some historical evidence is that it's been found that countries with open economies and greater international trade are less likely to engage in war, less likely to host civil wars, and have fewer genocides. A third pacifying force is what Peter Singer called the expanding circle, although the idea was first stated by Charles Darwin in The Descent of Man, namely that evolution bequeathed us with a sense of empathy. That's the good news. The bad news is that by default, we apply it only to a very narrow circle of allies and family. But over history, one can see the circle of empathy expanding from the village to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, to more recently to other races, both sexes, children, and even to other species. This just begs the question of what expanded the circle, and I think one can argue that increased forces of cosmopolitanism pushed it outward. An appreciation of history, literature, media, journalism, and travel encourages people to adopt the perspective of a real or fictitious other person, and experiments by Daniel Batson and others have shown that this indeed does lead to an increase in empathy for the actual person, but also for the category that that person represents. Some historical evidence is that the humanitarian revolution of the 18th century was preceded by the Republic of Letters, the great increase in amount of discourse at all levels. The long peace and rights revolutions in the second half of the 20th century were at least simultaneous with the electronic global village. And perhaps, this is very speculative, but it's often been stated that the rise of the internet and social media might have been behind the color revolutions in the Arab Spring of the 21st century. Finally, I think the final and perhaps most profound pacifying force is the escalator of reason. That as literacy, education, and the intensity of public discourse increase, people are encouraged to think more abstractly and more universally. And that will inevitably push in the direction of a reduction of violence. People will be tempted to rise above their parochial vantage point. That makes it harder to privilege one's own interests over others. It replaces a morality based on tribalism, authority, and Puritanism with a morality based on fairness and universal rules. It encourages people to recognize the futility of cycles of violence and to see it as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. Well, what's the evidence for that? Well, we do know that abstract reasoning abilities, as measured by the most abstract components of an IQ test, have increased in the 20th century, the so-called Flynn effect, which shows that not only has there been an increase of about 3 IQ points per decade since the beginning of the 20th century, but the gains have been concentrated not in actual knowledge, such as vocabulary and information, but rather in abstract reasoning, such as in similarities questions. What do an egg and a seed have in common? What do an inch and a pound have in common? And it's been shown that people, that is individuals, but also societies with higher levels of education and measured intelligence commit fewer violent crimes, cooperate more in experimental games. Again, we'll hear from both Martin and Lida on this technique. Have more classically liberal attitudes, that is, are less likely to be racist, sexist, xenophobic, homophobic, and are more receptive to democracy. Well, whatever the causes of the decline of violence, I think it has profound implications. One of them is, I think, that it calls for a reorientation of our efforts toward violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset, to ask not just the question, why is there war, but what might be a better question, why is there peace? Not just what are we doing wrong, but what have we been doing right? Because we have been doing something right, and it seems to me that it's rather important to understand what it is. In particular, I think it has implications for our assessment of modernity, the centuries-long process in which there's been an erosion of family, tribe, tradition, and religion by the forces of individualism, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science. Now, everyone acknowledges that modernity has given us longer and healthier lives, less ignorance and superstition, richer experiences, but there is a widespread romantic movement that questions the price. Is it really worth it to have a few years of better health if the price is muggings, terrorism, Holocaust, world wars, gulags, nuclear weapons, and so on? But I would argue that despite impressions, the long-term trend, though certainly halting and incomplete, is that violence of all kinds is decreasing. I think this calls for a rehabilitation of the concept of modernity and progress, and I think a sense of gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thanks very much. Comments, questions?
Steve, I was going to ask you, mentioned at the beginning that there's no guarantee this continues.
Yeah.
But what are some of the things you think are most likely to set the trend and bump it up again?
Yeah, one of them is the unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld. The things coming out of the blue that some fanatical dictator under the sway of some ideology festering somewhere in the world who will gather supporters, take over a country, decide it's a good idea to reconquer the neighbors, and I think that kind of thing can happen. We don't know where, we don't know when. It's just unwise to predict that trends will continue smoothly. It's possible that some fanatic who gets his hands on a stray nuclear weapon could send the statistics skyward. I mean, that would be one guy or one cell or one group. It would, depending on the almost philosophical question of whether one person who does an enormous amount of damage constitutes a counterexample to the world becoming less violent. I mean, no one else thinks it's a good idea, but one person can do a lot of damage, or at least one small group. It's conceivable that climate change will cause a struggle over land or water, although I might add that that is not a given, and that studies that have tried to correlate resource scarcity and climate shocks in time 1 with violence in time 2, holding everything else constant, have found virtually no correlation. That is, famines can cause a lot of misery, but they can sometimes cause local skirmishes over watering holes, but in general they don't lead to wars, because wars require the decision of some organized entity who may not particularly care about whether his population are starving or not in the calculations that lead him to declare war or not. The United States, for example, during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, didn't have a civil war. The civil war that we did have was over quite another matter. So I'm enumerating possibilities and saying that I don't think that this is inevitable, though it's certainly possible. So those are 3 big ones. Yeah.
I've heard, probably on bad authority and with a small sampling, that there's no evidence of violence among Cro-Magnon populations. Is there any truth to that rumor?
I don't think we probably don't have enough skeletons to know. There's some indirect evidence that violence goes back farther than Cro-Magnon. For one thing, depending on how you interpret the evolutionary continuity, certainly common chimpanzees engage in what we would call genocide if it occurred among humans. I guess we call it chimpicide, and probably the common ancestor of humans and chimps did as well. There is evidence for violent trauma and cannibalism in Homo heidelbergensis, which is the common ancestor of Neanderthals and sapiens. There are also, in our genome, there are genes that defend us against prion diseases that are transmitted through cannibalism, which suggests that cannibalism goes back several 100,000 years. And the fact that we're a sexually dimorphic species with the males bigger than the females, which you tend to get on average in species that have more violent male-male competition. All of them are indirect evidence that say that violence goes back a long way. I think you're right that there's no direct evidence in Cro-Magnon. There are cave paintings with wars, but I think the oldest that we know of is about 6,000 years ago. Yeah, seriously.
I'm imagining there are some people that are quite offended by your thesis.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
who are you hearing from and what are you hearing?
Yeah. There are a number of people for whom this is surprisingly a very unwelcome message. Activists of various kinds don't like to hear that good news, because by their reckoning, it encourages complacency. Oh, the world is okay. Why bother stamping out human trafficking and so on? I actually think that they're mistaken, just even in the practical implications, that it's much more likely that people reading about horrific events, say in Africa, just write off the whole continent as some kind of hellhole. Why throw money into a snake pit? Maybe they were better off when they were colonized, and granting them independence was a bad idea. The fact that actually things work, it goes down. I mean, it ought to go down farther, I argue, is more of a reason to put money and effort into resources that we know work. And so I think we'll actually encourage activism rather than just discourage it. There's a kind of conservative romanticism of pre-modernity, that the Enlightenment was a terrible mistake, that things were better when people had moral clarity of church and family and community, kind of communitarian, romantic, has left-wing and right-wing flavors, but kind of green romanticism. There is the kind of militant, there's an Americocentric theory of world history that says that everything bad happening in the world can be attributed to the actions of the United States. The kind of Chomskyan analysis of politics, where if you say that there's anything good about Western civilization, and granted there's much bad that's about Western civilization, but if you identify anything that's good, that's considered somewhat reactionary. There are anarchists and radical libertarians who believe that all evil is caused by the state. So those are some of the directions.
Do you address that in the book, or is that something you should write an essay about?
It'll probably, I didn't want in the book to do too much work with my critics. I'll let them do some of the work and respond. But I do mention that all of these things happen. Yes, Danny.
I'm just curious whether you see a decline in the ability to dehumanize categories of people. I mean, if we look at genocides in the 20th century, Nazi Germany, Srebrenica, you get people who are fairly normal in every way, and they can become convinced that there is no difference between other people and animals, and it happens clearly, can be made to happen. Intelligence is no defense against it. Literacy is no defense against it. And what other forces do you think? That's. Yeah,
I think I actually would put it the other way around. I think the default probably is that you do dehumanize everyone outside your circle, and that what we were seeing is either the remaining pockets or a natural backsliding. There are actually I think two different mindsets that allow these atrocities to happen. One of them is dehumanizing, where you consider other groups of people less than human. Then there's demonizing, where you consider them to be fully human, which makes them all the more contemptible because of the evil choices that they have made. And Daniel Goldhagen has actually done a 2x2 taxonomy of genocides as to whether the victims were demonized, dehumanized, or both. But I think you see well before the 20th century, just for example, a lot of the descriptions of Native Americans by settlers, colonists, governments use the language of vermin. When it was asked, for example, after various massacres, why kill all the children? If it's just the warriors that have been harassing you, why kill the babies? And the answer, independently offered by a number of colonists, was, well, if you want to get rid of the lice, you have to kill the nits. And this is the same language was used by Oliver Cromwell in genocide of the Irish and the reconquest of Ireland. So I think it's pretty, the vermin metaphor is pretty common. I do think that, I agree that literacy is no, and certainly intellectualism are not guarantees against it, but I think there are probably statistical forces that do push against it, that cosmopolitanism, reading accounts of what it's like to be a Native American or a Vietnamese peasant are likely to reduce the probability of dehumanization, but it is a tendency I think we naturally backslide into. Yeah, Jaron.
I'd like to hypothesize one symbolizing force, which is the perception of multiple overlapping hierarchies of status. And I've observed this to be helpful in dealing with rehabilitating gang members in Oakland and in designing internet communities, and I think in America in general. That, when there are multiple overlapping hierarchies, when one can proceed with status, there's more chances of people finding the wiggle room to feel okay about not fighting whoever's their superior in the status chain. And in organizational structures, I've noticed that the more severe the imposition of a single hierarchy is in people's lives, the more they're likely to engage in conflicts over part of America's success is just the confusion factor of understanding how to assess somebody's status.
Yeah, no, I think that's quite profound. And there are studies of competitions of dominance or revenge that suggest that when people are confined to one pecking order, all of their social worth depends on where they are, whereas if they belong to multiple overlapping groups. So for example, if someone, if I do something stupid when I'm driving and someone gives me the finger and calls me an asshole, it's not the end of the world. I'm a tenured professor. On the other hand, if status among other men was my only source of worth in life, I might have road rage and pull out a gun. And I think that although it's hard to identify exactly which factors, modernity comprises a lot of things. And so it's hard to tease them all apart. But I suspect that when you're not confined to a village, a clan, you can seek your fortunes in a wide world. That is going to be a pacifying force for exactly that reason. Also, even at the projecting upward to the way we intellectualize our affairs, an interesting development over the 20th century is the concept that you can be, say, Jewish and American, and this is not a conflict. You can be both, or Italian American, and the hyphen doesn't compromise either. That you actually belong, the idea that you don't categorize people into mutually exclusive circles, but overlapping ones. There's Amartya Sen wrote a book on this called, I think, Cosmopolitanism and Identity. And we kind of take it for granted that we have loyalties that go of different kinds in different directions. But it's surprising how recent this appreciation is. There's a quote from that great progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, the man who purged the federal government of black employees, who resegregated Princeton when he was president of the university. And he said, any American who carries around a hyphen is wielding a dagger that he is aiming at the heart of the republic. That is, Italian Americans, Irish Americans. Now, this seems Neanderthal today, but he's obviously a smart man, and it's made sense to him and obviously other people at the time. We think, well, you go to Knights of Columbus and that's the Italian part, and you salute the flag and that's the American part, and what's the big deal? These two overlapping polities that we belong to. But that involves some cognitive sophistication, and probably the default is to essentialize people, and you can't have two essences. It's not an essence if there are two of them. And so this abstract thinking of overlapping matrices, I think, is part of the Flynn effect-driven increase in tolerance, classical liberalism, and so on. Yeah, Lita.
Well, I was wondering two things. One very odd, which is when you were talking about dehumanization, there's starting to be evidence that people who are more bring things more in terms of in-group and out-group and have more out-group fear also have a greater perceived vulnerability to disease. They feel that they're more vulnerable to disease, and especially since you're living in close contact with your family and friends, you already have their germs. The people who you're most likely to catch diseases from are people from other groups, and which I was wondering in looking at these trends, if you're seeing any trends in decline in the fear of outgroups and the kinds of wars that can come from that go along with increases in public health. That would decrease people's perceived vulnerability to disease.
Right. Randy Thornhill claims that there is such a correlation.
Well, it's not just Randy. There's people who've been finding, there's more and more people who are finding that kind of link between the pathogen fears and in-group out-group psychology.
It's certainly possible. I mean, I suspect that it's more driven just cognitively by just how you, who you naturally categorize as on the outside of your circle of empathy, but it's possible that the size of that circle is driven by some kind of contamination.
Right, I think that's the claim. But the real question I had was about the cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
Because I'm puzzled by that in a certain sense, because it almost sounds like come be an undergraduate and everything is going to be okay. And when I look around me, I'm wondering if that is a real factor that's contributing to this. It must be driven a lot by popular culture, because you don't have massive numbers of people reading Proust and whatever. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a kind of a rising tide lifts all the boats, so that I mean, it sounds very elitist to say that, but attitudes towards, say, women, homosexuals, racial minorities, the tolerant attitudes that we celebrate, not beating up your kids, they tend to start among the most educated strata, but you can see the rest of the country being dragged behind. So a lot of these statistics, the kind of red states today have attitudes that the blue states had 30 years ago towards women, towards spanking, towards homosexuals, towards animal rights, and so on. So I think that what starts out at the universities and the pundits and so on trickles down and becomes conventional wisdom. And I think that probably happens worldwide as well, so that there's, again, this is this is another thing I'll probably get flack for saying it, but you can, very roughly, you can see a continuum in the world in a lot of these variables. Basically, kind of Western Europe, American blue states, American red states, Latin America and Asian democracies, and the Islamic world and Africa pulling up the rear, where we can look at, say, the criminalization of homosexuality in Africa or human trafficking and say that the world is in a terrible state, which of course it is, but the historical trend is that the other parts of the world eventually catch up. Slavery would be a very concrete example, where 50 years ago slavery was still legal in Saudi Arabia.
But that's the legal part. I thought that there was I don't know quantitatively, but I thought there was an increase in slavery, alarming increase in slavery recently.
No, I don't think there is. I mean, in terms of human trafficking, one thing, human trafficking is, I think, really can't be compared to African slavery, the African slave trade, in terms of the death rate, the suffering inflicted on the people, the amount of time that it lasts in a person's life, and even then, it's a fraction of what the percentage of people under slavery used to be. Probably in past centuries, a majority of the world's population could be classified as slaves. So I think what you're seeing there is a common dynamic where there's a sudden increase in concern, which looks like an increase in incidence. We actually care about it. I don't think 50 years ago people did. George?
Yeah, a question about when you speak to nuclear weaponeers, they like to take a lot of credit.
Yes.
They'll say, well, what we did may have been bad, but look, we had no major war between the black race. So they like to take your graph and make a very different conclusion and take the credit for it. Do you think they're taking more credit than they do?
There is, someone, Elspeth Rostow, proposed that the nuclear bomb be given the Nobel Peace Prize. I suspect not. For one thing, if you actually see if the distribution of nuclear weapons predicts peace through deterrence, it rarely, if ever, does. So, for example, the Soviet Union established its hegemony over Eastern Europe in exactly the era in which the United States was a nuclear monopoly, the late 1940s. You have lots of cases where a non-nuclear power challenges a nuclear power. Argentina challenging Britain in the Falklands, Egypt challenging Israel in 1973, many countries challenging the United States, colonial Algeria seceding from France. The reason that I think it hasn't, there are two reasons why I think it actually hasn't been a critical factor. One of them is that there's been a growing, especially since 1962, but probably growing before that, this concept of a nuclear taboo. Namely that nuclear weapons live in this sphere of hypotheticals that you use to defend yourself against an existential threat. But in actual battlefield calculations, it's just not a live option. The last time it was breathed as a live option was when Barry Goldwater used off the top of his head that there's no reason not to use tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam. That led to the Daisy ad and to Lyndon Johnson winning the biggest landslide in history. So the nuclear weapons, paradoxically, are just so militarily useless, that they haven't really, I think, affected balance of power considerations. But also, this is not to deny that deterrence has been important, but just that the massive amount of destruction that countries like the US and the USSR could inflict with conventional weaponry made each of them very nervous about the other, even if neither side had nuclear weapons. World War II in Europe didn't involve nuclear weapons, but was a kind of destruction that no one wanted to see again through just massive conventional weaponry. So that is it's certainly a very popular theory, the theory of the nuclear peace, but I'm more skeptical of it.
It's important for you to say that. So
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Do you think it's possible that we've sort of shifted the violence toward one another, toward other life forms? You know, especially through mechanization, the idea that now we have factory farming and plundering of industrial fishing and things like that. So
Yeah.
it seems like those have increased.
I suspect not. I mean, if you look at in the history of treatment of animals, cruelty to animals goes back probably as far as our species goes back, indifference to the welfare of animals. What has changed is basically efficiency. We can scoop up fish faster than we used to, and certain changes in habits, such as starting in the 60s, people got the idea that chicken was healthier that white meat's healthier than red meat. And so if you switch from beef to poultry, it takes 200 chickens to provide the same amount of meat as one cow. And so that creates the demand for a vastly larger number of sentient lives to be brought into being and snuffed out to meet the same demand. And people are just, until recently, indifferent to the source of their dinner. So I think there's a constant level of callousness and indifference. There's been an increase in industrial efficiency, but now, of course, there's also, really certainly in the West for the first time, an actual concern about the welfare of the animals that gave their lives for our dinner. And you have both an increase in vegetarianism, an increase in the number of laws passed that protect the rights of farm animals, an increase in the efforts by the industrial farmers to at least project an image of caring for animals, which probably have led to improvements in welfare. So there's enormous unrealized gains to be made in reducing cruelty. But I don't think it's been I think the historical direction is we care more rather than less, although below the radar a lot more bad things were happening. Yeah, Mike.
So everybody's always worried about the coming uptick in violence. And last week the Supreme Court tossed out this case against Brown versus the gaming industry and violence. And 7-2 decision. And the minority was written by Justice Breyer, who's generally viewed as the science judge.
Yeah.
And he goes into a long discussion, 50 references about how it's demonstrated that watching violence games, video games, playing and so forth, leads to much greater violence in children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, this is so bad that it should trump the free speech aspects of the issue.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts on that and these things that the culture is doing? Are there things out there boiling out around that may change this calculation, that may increase people's tendency to violence for a solution to the problem and so forth?
Yeah, no, I think the Supreme Court made the right decision. In fact, I signed on to an amicus brief in California when it was challenged, because I think the science that attempts to show that watching violent video games makes kids violent is bad. Most of it is blank slate science that just does correlations between the kids who like violent entertainment also commit more violence, and then leap from cause to effect, not factoring in the possibility that violent people like violent entertainment. In terms of cause and effect, I think there's very little, if any, evidence that there's any. I mean, aside from irrelevant things, that you show kids the Three Stooges and they run around the lab a lot more in the 10 minutes afterwards. And that's the science. And historically, Historically, the great age of video game violence, which has been since the 1990s, and it is gruesome stuff, those are exactly the decades in which violence in the United States plummeted. From the great crime decline, crime has gone down, violent crime in the United States, actually in all Western countries. This is a trend I didn't talk about in these graphs. You may have noticed when I plotted the rate of violence in European countries from the Middle Ages to the present. It went down and then there was a little uptick. That little uptick was the 1960s. It was a little bounce in violence through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, then got reversed in the 90s. So the 90s have brought us back to, this decade brought us back to some of the lowest rates of violence in American history, 4.8 per 100,000 per year. The lowest was in the 50s of 4.0. Exactly when video games exploded. And I think there's a reason for it, and a reason why I think that violent entertainment, which goes way back, including special effects with actors, Shakespearean actors would have bladders filled with pig blood so that one stabs the other, there was a big spurt of gore. So people have always liked violent entertainment. I think the correlation is poor because just of human motivation. Why are people violent? It's because they want someone else to come to harm. That accounts for all the variance. How often you see it done, whether you see it done in your imagination, is separate from how many other people in the world do you want dead. And so that's why I think that it's a bit of a red herring. Yeah.
Have you commented on what happens on the statistics of soldiers firing their guns?
Yeah. Yes.
Because
there's a widely spread factoid that most soldiers are inhibited from firing their guns in battle.
That most soldiers, there has been training that is very effective, that soldiers currently do fire their guns. Yes.
I think and this is sometimes used in service of the idea that we have innate inhibitions against killing. I think there is such a feature of human psychology. We don't physically harm another person lightly. The reason that I think it's a bit misleading, though, is that it's one of those inhibitions that is not only easy to overcome, but very pleasurable to overcome. So it's kind of like it's in the same category as aversion to eating spicy foods or strong cheese or rock climbing. There is, I think, an innate tendency to avoid it, but there's tremendous pleasure taken in overcoming that avoidance. And of course, the history of hand-to-hand combat, going to Homeric Greece, shows that people very easily lose whatever inhibitions they have against causing harm. The second reason that I think it's a bit misleading is that most human violence, indeed, probably is not kind of mano-a-mano physical conflict. It's cowardly violence. It's pre-dawn raids, it's ambushes, it's drive-by shootings. And when the inhibition I think we have is you meet an adversary who's on average as big and strong and mean as you are, you're not going to give him reason to kill you lightly by attacking him. When you can get away with it without fear of reprisal, then the inhibitions are gone. And that's where, in fact, in tribal conflict, that's where the big numbers pile up. One reason I think anthropologists were misled until they started counting about rates of death in primitive warfare is that they only looked at pitched battles, where you have the two sides in war paints and the spears and the drums, and they make a lot of noise, and then one side backs down, and then that led to the conclusion, well, violence is only ritualistic. But what they didn't count was all the times in which one tribe would tiptoe into another village before dawn and then fire arrows through people as they left their huts in the morning to pee, and would annihilate the entire village. That's what gave rise to the high counts. Yeah, John.
A constitution resistant to believing things I would like to believe. So this is so pleasant, and it seems to me that very well founded are the events that are aggregated over large populations. But when you start to enter a world of small numbers of nation states, individual events count, individual decision makers count, as you say.
Yeah.
And so if you look at World War II, right before World War II, in the decades before World War II, fascism independently took control in Italy, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Hungary, on and on. And if you add the sort of Marxian variants of oppression and celebration of a certain type of war and so on, then essentially all continental Europe except the Netherlands and Switzerland and a few small scale more business-oriented trading places went in that direction. And then if you look at the outcome of the war, it was a very close thing. That is, for a while it was only Britain against the continent of Europe. And so it could very easily have gone in the George Orwell direction of Eurasia, East Asia, systems of warfare.
Yeah, well, and it kind of did in half of Europe.
Right.
The eastern half, yeah.
No, exactly. So anyway, that's one sort of cautionary element to me is that, and then I think about what's the likelihood that every conceivable trend would be in the right direction for us as opposed to some trends overshooting. So for example, it's hard to look at the rise of what I think of as the grip of the Enlightenment as not as spread out, basically under the armies of the English-speaking people. It was imposed by force in Japan, imposed by force on continental Europe, then if you look at other places, and we like to think, and I used to think that spontaneously everybody would adopt liberal democracy. Okay. But you look at places like Africa or the Middle East, and they've proven remarkably resistant. And high levels of warfare go along with this resistance. And one wonders whether, for example, we've now crossed the threshold where, for example, the rise of automatic weapons, that could the U.S. have formed a liberal democracy if everybody had automatic weapons, or is that some kind of thing where every teenager in Africa, 13 years old, not everyone, but very large numbers of them have automatic weapons, and you have this hellish circumstance, and whether that would have been similar here. So I'm saying this, that the initial sort of liberal revolution led to sort of openness and trade and these neutral valuations as cosmopolitan direction. But then that also leads to a less willingness, the very nature. So people in these democracies now are largely unwilling to defend themselves. So if you look at in Europe, as Secretary of Defense recently remarked, is unable to sustain a campaign of more than a few weeks outside of Europe.
Robert Kagan said Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus.
But even in the U.S., blue staters, if you look at who goes into the Army, there's all these myths that it's stupid people or ignorant people or this, but it's not. It's people it's rural people, slightly better educated, and who are religious. Okay, and those people are getting fewer in the liberal cosmopolitan revolution. And so Dennis Miller has a line that we get our pet myths FedEx to our front doors, and our medications for our pets FedEx to our front doors. Okay, and that Al Qaeda looks at that and says, we could take these guys. and so the question is, do some of these processes overshoot? Are we getting
such pansies that? Yeah. Okay, so those are two questions. I think they're both excellent questions. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. The first one, it is certainly true that there can be enormously contingent events where a small number of people do a lot of damage and they can blindside you. And so that was why, in answer to Ben's question, I said, what could go wrong? Well, that could always go wrong. Of course, there are two ways of thinking about it. You could say we've been amazingly lucky and it could blow at any moment. You could also say we just went through an extraordinary period of bad luck. Hitler had been gassed a little bit more thoroughly in the trenches in World War I, there probably would have been no World War II in Europe, there probably would have been no nuclear arms race, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes both ways, and the question is, how have the odds been shifting? Is the probability of a Hitler coming to power now the same as it was in the 30s? I think it's not zero, I think it's probably less. Worldwide, there has been, and the question is, I think a few years ago, you could have worried that the world, large parts of the world just couldn't stand the idea of liberal democracy. Yeah, I think with the Arab Spring, we have to reassess even that. And even that isn't just a few events of the last 6 months, but a Gallup poll of the Islamic world conducted in 2005 had a lot of surprises in terms of the pretty large current of liberalism that was kind of seething beneath the surface of both the Ayatollahs and theocrats on the one side and the oil kleptocrats on the other side. That I wouldn't say a majority, it depends on the country, but support for democracy, freedom of speech, women's rights is actually, there's a substantial proportion of the Islamic world, a majority in certain countries who are in favor of it, which made the Arab Spring not a total surprise. Now, I wouldn't go so far as, say, Francis Fukuyama, who just says history has momentum in that direction. There's this mysterious dialectical process, and we're seeing the end of history. I would localize it to more circumscribed processes like technologies of cosmopolitanism, spread of ideas. But I do think there is, we can't discount the possibility that liberal democracy ultimately is a pretty attractive vision, and that it may be like cell phones, that when it's available, it's a gadget that people do find appealing. I wouldn't predict that that's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened.
Thank you.
Okay.